Well, before I start, I will just say this is my own personal account of Margaret Phelan, and I first got to know her in the early 70s when I was here in secondary school. And this is, I suppose, how I would remember her latterly, with the Rudolf Hetzel presidential chain for Rose House. And I was talking to Aoife Hetzel the other day, and Aoife said that MMP, as I always refer to her, was kindness itself when they set up shop here in Rose House. And she was not just with Rudolph and Eva, but with almost everyone she met. She was hugely encouraging, and that's what made her such a success in her life, and in the purchase and the restoration and the survival of this unique complex in Kilkenny. She was a charming woman. There was a core of iron, but she was charming, and she would never get cross with you. And I, as I said, I knew her for about 25 or 26 years. And this is how I first knew her. This is how she appeared about 1972 or 73, when I came into Rose House one Wednesday or Saturday afternoon trying to escape GAA in St. Kieran's. And she was at the front desk with Maureen Callery. And she asked me my name, and I didn't know her. And I just said who I was, and then a flood of memories came out. She asked me if I was anything to my grandfather, who was the same name as myself, from Lower Grange in Goresbridge, and then she mentioned my Uncle Dan, with whom Dr. Willie Phelan and herself had a relationship, and Dr. Ellen Cody had a relationship for many years. So that's how, and that is taken in 1978, I think, when she was on a tour. She went on 2 tours to the United States of America, 68 and 78, to raise funds for the Kilkenny Archaeological Society. So that's how she looked when I first met her. And here's a very characteristic photograph of her from the mid-60s, and I think that is it's Oisin O'Kelly. I'm not sure, but I think it is. And at some event in KTW, you can see from the catalogue she has in her hand. So I started by looking at the 1901 census to see where Richard Duggan, her father, and their household were living. And I picked them up in 23 James Street, which surprised me because I'd always heard MMP talk about 8 William Street as the family home. But in 1901, at the time of the census, they were living, and it's in James Street, and it's a considerable household. Peter Duggan, Thomas Duggan, Richard Duggan, and then a governess, Kate Stapleton, Ellen Quirk, a nurse, Annie O'Neill, housekeeper, and I think Richard Duggan had O'Neill ancestry, so I wondered, was Annie O'Neill some kind of a relative? Noah Dewan and Ellen Dewan. So that's a considerable household in 23 James Street. So they must have been bursting at the seams. And then when Daisy was born, they moved in 1902. They were living at 8 William Street. And in 1911 I picked them up on the census again, and the family consisted of Richard Henrietta, who was Henrietta Fitzgibbon from Castlereagh. The family had a considerable business like the Duggans in the Monster House in Castlereagh. I think also they were involved in a kind of a wholesale business as well for the west of Ireland. So like Richard Duggan in the Monster House, they were hugely successful drapers and entrepreneurs of their time, and had a huge hinterland. I think Richard Duggan even sent goods to the west of Ireland. I think I remember MMP saying. So then you see the house there: Peter, Jack, Daisy, Evelyn. I think must be Mrs. Black. I never met her. She was dead, I think, by the mid-70s. And then there was one other sister who only appeared in 1916, I think, who we all knew as Ninbly. So Patrick, 3 years, he went into the business like all the other brothers except Tommy, who was killed in the Great War, and then he afterwards went to Limerick and went out on his own. And then you see there's a Nellie Duggan, a niece, and then the various domestics. So that's in 1911, living in 8 William Street. And I remember MMP saying to me, I'll leave that for a moment. There's 8 William Street, a fine substantial 3-storey 5-bay house. and that's where Daisy was born in 22nd of December 1902. In the 1980s, when she was widowed, she nearly bought an adjacent house, but on reflection decided that 10 College Road with its garden was far more suitable to her. Some of the Phelans might correct me on that, but anyway, that's I think the garden in 10 College Road was a key factor in her decision to buy College Road, because when she was widowed in 1963, they lived in the doctor's house out in Talbot's Inch. So they had, which was belonging to the medical board. And then this is a view of the Monster House as we all knew it. Richard Duggan. And she gave an interview to the Boston Globe in America about I don't know whether it's 68 or 78. The article I have is undated, but she refers to it as one of the first supermarkets for drapery. And there was also a wholesale business and a postal service attached to the shop, which covered Connacht and even the Aran Islands. 3 of her 4 brothers went into the business: Peter, Dick, Jack, and Paddy. Paddy did go into the business, I gather, but then moved on later on. And Paddy's daughter is here tonight, is that correct? Yes. Richard Duggan played cricket, and my grandfather played cricket, and my father and uncle played cricket. And I often wondered, and it's only when I was doing this lecture that I was a bit slow, that I worked out what the connection was. The connection with the Duggans was true cricket, because my grandfather and Richard Duggan would have known each other. And this photograph from 1905 shows Richard Duggan in the back.
Oh, good.
And my grandfather here.
Oh.
And there's a smithy here.
Yeah.
And there's Eustace Duckett here from County Carlow.
Yeah.
And quite a few others are army officers stationed in Kilkenny. So if you moved on, this is 1905 or 6, if you moved on 15 years, that photograph wouldn't be taken, because the political climate had changed so much in Kilkenny after 1916. But anyway, it's made up. There's a man called, there's a Captain Perry who lived at Bamford on the outskirts of Kilkenny. There's a ruin of the house still there. So that's taken in Kilkenny somewhere. There must have been there was a cricket ground, I'm sure, somewhere. And another man in that photograph is Godfrey Day, who became Bishop of Ossory, married one of the Languishes, and later on in 1938 became Archbishop of Dublin, and died before he was enthroned. He was only a couple of months in the position. So that's quite a mix of Catholic, Protestants, businessmen, landowners, but the common denomination is all playing cricket. And here's one from 1907 taken at TCD. The Kilkenny team were up playing Trinity, and Richard Duggan is this man again. This is my grandfather, Godfrey Day. And I'm not sure, I don't have all the names. Anyway, it doesn't really matter here. Well, that's 1907. Here's Kilkenny on the outbreak of just before the Great War. I'm just putting in this here to show you how prosperous looking the High Street was. And Duggans were all part. Duggans were very much part of this business world in Kilkenny City. And there was a reference somewhere to 40 people living in the Monster House around the time of the war or shortly after it. And it was Daisy's mother who had the responsibility for keeping all these housed and fed. And she occasionally, one of her memories was, I don't know whether it's William Street or whether it was around the Monster House side, that there was a fabulous bathroom put in. Just
William Street,
is it? And it lasted for many years.
Yeah.
Well, in August 1914, everything changed, and this was the war that was to end all wars, and it was to be over by Christmas. And one of Daisy's older brothers or half brothers, Tommy Duggan, enlisted, much against his father's. He didn't wish him to go, and he was going. I think Daisy told me at one stage he was going to enlist as a private, and Richard Duggan objected to that and wouldn't allow him to enlist as a private. So Richard Duggan's wife Henrietta was a Fitzgibbon of, as I said, of Castlereagh, and she was the father of John Fitzgibbon, I think, who was a member of the Irish Parliamentary Party and was an MP in Westminster. So I think they were able to use a bit of influence to get Tommy a commission in an English regiment they couldn't get a commission in an Irish regiment because you had to be part of the landed gentry aristocracy to get a commission in an Irish regiment. There was far more English regiments, and it was much easier to get a commission in that. Anyway, Tommy enlisted, and he was killed on the 13th of November 1916, aged 21. So look at that. It just gives. When you think of MMP, you don't really think of the First World War and her losing a brother in the, but she did. Another cousin, well, not of hers, but of her half siblings, was acting Captain James Shelley of Ballywater in Callan, and that's just he'd be a first cousin, I presume, of Peter and Jack, and the Richard Duggan married first Shelley of Callan, and then secondly he married Henrietta Fitzgibbon. So that's a Shelley connection. Loretto was her first school, and Loretto then had a primary school and a secondary school, and then she went to Our Lady's Bower in Athlone, where she had an aunt, a Fitzgibbon aunt, I think, who was a nun. And then in 1920 she went off to UCC. I was a bit surprised that a girl of the business class and community at that stage would have been allowed to go to university, because girls much later were not given that, were not considered to be worthwhile education. Marriage was the sole occupation. But Bill Phelan was telling me this afternoon that she persisted with her father until he allowed her to go to university. So there was determination there from very early on. And she took 2 degrees, an arts degree and a business degree. And she occasionally said, I think the hope was that she would go into the Duggan business. But anyway, she did quote this to me. The brothers used to say to her, "Be A, be common, be damned." There was 3 brothers in the Richard Duggan in the Monster House business, and then Paddy left for Limerick. So I suppose they didn't want another partner in the business, especially a woman who'd be telling them what to do. So anyway, she must have. I'm not sure what year she finished in UCC. I think it's either 3 or 4 years degree. So we were talking about 1924, I suppose, when she finished her degree. And we have a photograph of her at UCC. And then we have another photograph. Well, anyway, I have another photograph, but it wasn't all study. And she once told me that she was playing golf at this stage too, and she won a golf competition in UCC or in Cork, and the prize money was 2 guineas. And she went off and bought these 6 dessert spoons, and I often admire them. And so she left them to me in her will. They possibly belonged to the Fox, because they have their crest is the Chinook. One of the things that Daisy had, she had an amazing eye for good furniture, and her sister Nin had the same appreciation and knowledge. I remember going to an auction with Nin once, and there wasn't very much in it. It was some kind of a connection out in Stonyford, and there was a lovely little round table, and it wasn't sold at the auction. So Nin put in a bid afterwards and got it, and had it restored. And Nin obviously saw the potential of it, and it came out beautiful. And I just thought it was past it. But anyway, M&P and Nin, they both had a huge appreciation and knowledge of antique furniture, and they were in both their houses. It was very much present. One of the other memories she had of their time in UCC was being at a dance, and the president of UCC came in and said the hands had just burned Cork, the centre of Cork City, and the president told them all to go home. And I was reading something lately, and it just said the estimated damage to Cork City at the time was £2 million, which doesn't seem very much to us. But when you put it into the context of loss of 2,000 jobs, that gives you some appreciation of the actual loss. And then here she is as a graduate. Yes, and she does say her ambition in this Boston Globe article. She clearly said her ambition was to be a really superb businesswoman. But anyway, that that didn't come out immediately, but it came out much later in her life, I think we can see. And then in 1922 her father bought Butler House. And I had forgotten this fact, but she said to me it was the first house her father had purchased. He didn't own William Street, and he didn't own 23 James Street. So I asked her why not. He obviously had the wherewithal. And she said to me, yes, but he wanted to keep as much money for capital for the business as he possibly could. So it's only when he was in 1922 when he was born about 1850. So he was 71 or 2 when he made his first purchase of this fine house. It was divided into 2 then. Dr. Roach lived on the right hand side, and this was one of Kilkenny's grandest houses. So it was a huge and important acquisition for Richard Duggan. And around this time, or before the First World War, he had also been made a Justice of the Peace. And for a Roman Catholic not coming from an ascendancy or not coming from a landed background, this was, at that time they were beginning to, the British establishment or the Dublin government were trying to encourage Catholics to be involved and ordinary people to be involved in the government of the country, because my grandfather had an uncle who was a doctor, and he was also persuaded to become a JP, and another relative was Rice of Dunbell, a farmer. So they were actively trying to bring the middle class in to be involved in local government at this stage, which before it had been the preserve of the landed class. In 1925 she married Dr. Willie Phelan, the first county surgeon, who was a cousin of her half-brothers through the Shelleys of Ballywater. She said years later in a press interview that he was very interested in history and old buildings. He also played golf and was a captain of the Kilkenny Golf Club. I don't think he played bridge, which was a lifelong passion of MMP's, but one of his hobbies was national hunt racing. And this is how, when I met MMP in 1972, this is how we got chatting. And here's the family. I'm moving on to 1952. It's a beautiful photograph of the Phelan family with Philip Closey. It was taken, I believe, at Talbot's Inch, which was the last home of MMP and Dr. Willie Phelan. Earlier homes had been, I think one of the Phelan daughters used to joke about being brought up in the poorhouse. Because when he was first appointed, he lived in the poorhouse for a while. And then when they built the county hospital, there was a doctor's residence in the county hospital for a little while. But later on, I suppose it was too close. There was no rest for the doctor or for the surgeon, so I suppose they moved it out. They moved him out. But anyway, it was Talbot's Inch was the last home with her husband, and he died in 1963. Now, my connection with MMP, as I said, when I met her in 1972 or 3, and I said what my name was, and she immediately started reminiscing about my uncle and my grandfather. So here's I'll go through these briefly, just to give you, it's an almost unknown facet of MMP's life. And here she is leading in Sweet Eileen in 1951 at Listowel. A very successful filly they had, and afterwards they put it to, they sent it to stud, and one of the products of that was a filly called Fairnell, who ended up being owned by friends of my father up near Loughlin Bridge many years later. And Ellen Cody was telling me that she remembers many a morning going out to Low Grange with her father, Dr. Phelan, to see the horses and have a chat. And I suppose it was his way of relaxing and getting away from the medical world, however briefly. Sweet Eileen was born in 1939, and by 1942 she was with my grandfather in Low Grange, because I have a report of the stable from that year. And here she is winning at Leopardstown, no mean achievement. And at one stage I think she told me, I didn't look this up, but that she was runner-up in the Galway Plate. So quite a record. I don't know how many races she won, but it seems like she won 8 or 9 races. And this is the report from 1942. Sweet Eileen down as a 3-year-old, so born in 1939. Jack Duggan is also there as an owner, and the gallops at Low Grange were compared to Punchestown. It was a small, in those days racing establishments were quite small, maybe 8 or 9 owners, and most of my grandfather's owners were local people, such as the Blackmores and other local farming families or professional families. The Hearts solicitors were other patrons. Kitty and Rita's father, is it James Hart or Jack Hart, was a patron, and he was also my grandfather's solicitor. So it was all a very anyway, they all knew each other. And this is a lovely photograph of the Shelley house. It shows how substantial the Shelley family was. I think this house has largely, sadly, been abandoned. I'm not sure if there's anything standing, but it's one of these beautiful. Well, I think it's a very beautiful vernacular house. And I recently sent on a copy of this to the Irish Architectural Archive because it should be recorded. Anyway, and during when Sweet Eileen wasn't racing, the horses were sent out to the Shelleys in Ballywater for summer grazing or something like that. Am I right on that? That's what I recall anyway. That's just another report from the early 1940s. Sweet Eileen won at 5-4 on. So was Certainty. I wonder if Dr. Phelan was supplementing his salary, because my grandfather, despite the Turf Club's suspicions, was not a backing man. So somebody saw her as a Certainty that day anyway. And this is, as I said, Jack Duggan was another patron of my grandfather in Low Grange. And here is a photograph from the 1940s showing a very successful fillier that Jack Duggan had called Rosemary's Cottage, who raced in the 1940s. And then this is just a photograph from Gordon Park in the 1930s that shows Lady Helen McCalmont, who was a very great patron of National Hunt racing, presenting the Tetrathema Cup, which the McCalmounts had just established a few years previously in the 1920s, to my grandfather. And Uncle Dan is here, and then this is Major Dermot McCalmont, who died in the late 60s in South Africa in about 1967. So Dr. Willie Phelan would have known. He mightn't have known the McCalmounts intimately, but he would have known them to see. And this is a view of Gordon Park in the 1930s. They didn't have this in Gordon Park, and they were doing some research lately. So I gave them a copy of it. Now, we're coming up to one of the major themes of MMP's life is the Kilkenny Archaeological Society, which was refounded in 1945. And this is just the first journal, which fortunately I was able to acquire from the collection of the late Melosina Lennox Cunningham. It was very difficult to get. And the officers of the new society, Dr. W.P. Phelan, Chairman, MMP on the committee, Hubert Butler, Editor. So, the scene is set, and then the first article by MMP is the following year in the Old Kilkenny Review, and it's an article on the Tolsel. And she almost to the end of her life, she was writing an article every year for the Old Kilkenny Review, and she was also doing it for the Butler Society, which was established in 1967. And despite the Nuncio event and the boycott, the feathered boycott in the early 50s, she and Hubert always remained friends, and she made that point to me on a number of occasions. And I remember the event obviously saddened her very much, the boycott and the whole incident in the Kilkenny Archaeological Society. Hubert wasn't forced to go from the society. He resigned of his own. There was a vote on whether he should be retained or not, but he did. And that vote was won. But he resigned. And I remember walking into her bedroom in about 95 or 96. It was a winter's evening, and I had been working here in Roth House during the day. And a key would usually be left out under the mat, so I would just walk in and I'd shout up the stairs that it was me, and I'd go in and make the tea and get some biscuits or something and bring it up to her in her bedroom, and we'd sit and chat. And I walked in this late October, November evening, and the background to it was all the Bosnia-Herzegovina thing. And as I walked in the bedroom door, she said, and she was very, very serious, and she was a bit sad, and she just said, "Hubert was right after all." And she had just been listening to the radio about all the atrocities in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the whole business of the forced conversion of the Serbian and Croatian Orthodox Christians by the Roman Catholic Church, and the whole thing obviously upset her very much. And it's a memory that has stuck with me. She's sitting up in bed. She was 90. She was 92 or 94, and and just to say out of the blue as I walked in, Hubert was right after all. It just tells you something about the Irish Catholic Church and how enclosed it was, how we were very much an island nation, cut off largely from the continent in the Second World War. So for most people it was unbelievable that there would have been these atrocities in Croatia and Bosnia in the 1940s during the Second World War. And then I mentioned that with Hubert Butler, she was one of the founder members of the Butler Society, which came together in 1967. And the first rally was held that year. And this is just a newspaper photograph from the Kilkenny people showing the first society or the first rally dinner held in the Long Gallery at Kilkenny Castle. And you can see the place, the gallery was falling down at that time. The castle had just been surrendered or handed over to a restoration committee by Arthur Lord Ormond. And later on it was handed over to the state. But anyway, MMP was one of the leading organisers and members of that first rally, with a Garda inspector, George Butler, Hubert Butler, Paddy Lord Dunbine, and Kitty Lanigan. Kitty was on the restoration committee, and then she came on to the main committee. And it was MMP who invited me to come on to the Butler committee in 1990. So she was a very influential woman. On my side anyway. And of course these are just some the first Butler rally, Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull, that's often remembered. And then these are the various Butlers who attended from all over the world. And then we have a photograph of Charles J. Haughey with Minister Gibbons, who was a key figure in the acquisition, well, not in the acquisition of the castle, but in the castle being taken on by the state. And MMP used to talk about the role Kilkenny women played in getting a tourist office in Kilkenny. And I remember once she said to me that when they first approached the tourist board, they were appealing for a tourist office to be set up in Kilkenny, and it was largely turned down as who would want to go to Kilkenny. So anyway, for a couple of summers they manned an information desk in the arcade of the Tonsil. This is what she told me, and they collected signatures and they duly presented it in due course to Bord Fáilte or the tourist board. So they eventually got a tourist office. And of course the rest is history. Kilkenny Castle is now one of the main attractions of the southeast. And of course there's MMP with Kitty Lanigan. That's in 1967. And she's there with the Pope O'Mahony, Lords Ormond and Mountgarrett, and as I said, Kitty Lanigan. And that's just another view of the gallery. I didn't realise I had it in twice. And here's Kitty, a friend and colleague at KS and on the Butler Society Committee. Kitty had been on the Kilkenny Restoration Committee, as I mentioned also. So another key figure, and one of the key people involved in the work to acquire Roath House in 1962 and then its restoration. It opened to the public in '66, and in the interview she gave to the Boston Globe, she said she'd always been interested in the building, even when walking to school in Loretta from William Street. That's in the pre-Great War period, as I said, I've taken that quote from an article she gave in 1967, or no, 68 or 78, it's undated. The building was commenced in 1594 by John Roath and his wife Rose Archer. MMP and the role of Roath House in her life. This is again from the same interview. If my husband hadn't died in 1963, I would probably be the same sort of housewife as everybody else. and very happy to be that too. In 1968, MMP travelled on a fundraising tour to the USA, giving many lectures. The result was a good American membership for the Society, who provided valuable support for the restoration of the house and later the gardens. And one of the many friends who kept coming back to Kilkenny was Rosemary and Charles Butler from Coral Gables in Florida. And this is us in Nicholas Moss's coffee shop in probably the late 80s or early 90s. And this is just, the Butlers were always a fascination of MMPs, and she wrote quite a lot on them. And this is, we're in the Long Gallery, in Black Tom's Long Gallery at Carrick. And she was also, she liked Innisteig, and we would often come out on a picnic. And here she is at the well, the Holy Well, just behind the church in Innisteig. This is Idris Kelly, who's still alive and now in her 90s in Boston. She and her husband, Robert Kelly, were instrumental and key sponsors or key hosts for MMP on her first fundraising trip to the USA. And this is just a copy of the invitation for a party that they had at that time for MMP. And this is the article I keep mentioning, the Boston Globe 1978, and there she is sitting in her dining room in 10 College Road. It's a very characteristic photograph of her. And this is the lecture list, which was printed up for 1978, and look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 14 or 15 lectures she gave. It was, you know, it must have been hugely physically demanding, and this is of a woman who was then in her 70s, going out to fundraise for Roath House and KES. And this is MMP in front of Mrs. Kelly's fridge with Henry Weldon of Boston, who was a great friend of hers. Idris Kelly was telling me lately, Daisy had a long evening gown on, and they were telling each other, that's Henry Weldon and herself, telling each other that standing in front of my refrigerator was a perfect backdrop. Idris wrote in 2003, she was sending me on this information. She was downsizing and moving out of her family home. At this party I had invited 80 to 100 people, and Margaret held their attention for a good while, and of course she was being given a platform to talk about Kilkenny and Roath House. If my memory serves me well, I do believe she received quite a few donations. I'm quite sure she did. And this is from the 1970s. It's a photograph that Maureen Callery sent me years later. And of course it shows them in I think it must be about 1972 and 3, but I suppose around the time I met her. So you can see Mrs. DeLucre and Maureen Callery, and I should know who I think it's May Sparks on the, though I'm not too sure. I think that might be May Sparks, who was very involved. And this is Maureen. One of my earliest memories of coming in here was to see Dr. Powers, Surgeon Powers, French wardrobe, filled with costumes that used to stand over there. And one of the great treasures of that was on show then was a court costume which had been presented, I think, by the Grattan Bellews, or else by the Bryans of Jenkinstown to Roath House. It was a beautiful gents embroidered coat. So in 1987, after what, 62, 72, 82, almost 25, 26 years of working for Roath House, the city decided to make her confer on her the freedom of the city. It speaks volume about her standing in Kilkenny. Arthur Lord Ormond and Bishop Noel Willoughby were refused the honour, and MMP was only the second woman, the other to receive the honour, the other being Ellen Lady Desert. So it was a huge honour for her, and I can remember her being very chuffed about it. Anyway, we'll show you the recording of that, and this is the freedom of the city, the invitation to the event, which she sent out to me. And then this is another great day in Roath House. It's the opening of the third house, a day long worked for by MMP. President Mary Robertson did the honours. 401 years after John Roath and Rose Archer had commenced building on the site. So that was a terrific day, and that's her nephew John Bly standing here, isn't it? Yes. Yes. And then Antigone referred to the festschrift, which the society honoured her with in 1997, done in her honour. Archdeacon O'Doherty said of her at this time, "She is indeed one of Kilkenny's outstanding historians and ranks alongside Carrigan, Graves and Prim." Praise indeed, and she was a particularly strong admirer of the Reverend James Graves. I think that's his first name, and she often spoke about him and did research on him. Contributors. It speaks volumes. Ellen Pendergast from Paulstown, Adrian Empey, a Church of Ireland rector, Etienne Rynn from UCG, John Bradley, who had been one of her early prodigies here in Rothe House, Dorcas Birthistle, Gerard Crotty, who had been here in Kilkenny teaching for a year, became a lifelong friend of MMP's, writing on heraldry, Jane Phelan from Dublin, Harman Murtha, Peter Harbison, Mary Lightbound from London and Gore's Bridge, Conrad Manning, Maury J. Johnson, who wrote on costumes, Edward Law, who almost wrote on everything, Siobhan de Hoore, who was a lifelong friend of hers, very interested in the symbols of the Passion, like MMP, Aidan Ireland, Michael O'Dwyer, Frank McAvoy, Norman Linus, Fergus Farrell, William Nolan, and myself. And Archdeacon O'Doherty wrote the foreword. And then this is a photograph taken in Kilkenny Castle at the time of the launch of the festschrift, and it was a huge turnout. I always remember being very surprised at the number of people who turned out for it. And Etienne Rynn from UCG came to launch it. And then another thing we did here in Rothe House was this miniature exhibition in 1999. It had come about by pure chance. I was here in the house about Christmas '98, I think, and there was a bad storm, and this English pair came in, John and Pauline Comerford, and he brought in a miniature portrait of Bess Rose, and he asked me would I be interested in seeing it, and I said yes, I'd love to see it, and it's by John Comerford, the Kilkenny-born miniaturist. So from we started talking, and he said that himself and Pauline had been collecting for about 20 or 30 years, and with the result they had about 400 miniatures, one of the largest collection of miniatures in the British Isles. And a large portion of it was devoted to John Comfort, for the obvious reason. John was no connection. He didn't even know where his grandfather was born in Ireland, but he was drawn to Kilkenny and subsequently bought a house in Moulton's Grove. And then here's MMP in 1995 with other great friends, Jimmy and Katharina Delaney at Vicar Street, and she was always game for an evening out or a lunch out, and she was always very lively and chatty, and she was a great communicator, and I can still hear her laugh after someone had cracked a joke or all this in my memory. And this is another Jimmy Delaney and Catherine Delaney lunch party. Nin is obscured by Richard Delaney, and MMP is sitting here. There. So that's, and right up to the end she was going out. Now the legacy of MMP includes not only Rothe House and the complex, but it also includes her written legacy, and she, as I said, she had articles in almost every Kilkenny Review and later on in the Butler Journal. St Mary's Cathedral was a place of special interest, but also important to her as a Roman Catholic. In the 1968 interview to the American journalist, she described herself as a religious woman, and I remember her going to when I knew her in the 80s and 90s, going up to St Patrick's to Mass almost daily. But one of the articles she was most proud of was the article that was published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Antiquaries in 1996, and it was on a subject dear to her heart, the O'Carron School of Ossory, and this really pleased her, and she presented an off-print of it to me and various other friends, and I can remember her being really pleased and chuffed about it. And in the article to the American newspaper, she talks about religion in greater detail. It's a very basic part of my life. It always has been. She further declared, "It is part of the discipline by which I live." She acknowledged that religion played a less important role in people's lives, and this is by 1978, than it did for her generation. But isn't that a pity for them? And then she goes on to say, the Holy Spirit has an especially strong meaning for me. You always have the feeling of support in your life. So that's a direct quote from her life. One of the great passions of her life was also picnics. And we went on numerous picnics. I can remember going out to Kilkenny one time with her. And here's one at the Thai Mausoleum in Innisteak with Catherine Delaney. And there was always a good picnic. There was always plenty of tea, and there was cake, and there were sandwiches. So we would sit in the sunshine or in the rain and chat and talk. And this is another with Jimmy Delaney in front of the Flaxman Monument to Mary Tighe. Another lifelong passion was gardening. In 1942, she said, St. Luke's Hospital opened complete with residence in its own grounds for the county surgeon, and Margaret had great fun setting up the garden there. I was always very keen on gardening, she says. At the time of her death, all 5 children and their spouses were living. 25 grandchildren were flourishing, innumerable grandchildren, 9 when she gave the interview to the Boston Globe in the late 1970s. And that's more or less it.